This is GovExec Daily, where we bring you the federal stories that really matter. It's January 28th, 2022. I'm Ross John Fortune. According to an American Customer Satisfaction Index report released recently, citizen satisfaction with federal government services dropped to an all-time low score of 63.4% in 2021, continuing a four-year drop. The survey showed satisfaction in federal government services declining 2.6% throughout 2021. In its summary, ACSI suggested that the pandemic and a bifurcated political culture were contributing factors to an unprecedented run of negative movement in their index. The White House wants to do something about government customer service and the experience that citizens have. In December, the Biden administration announced a new executive order emphasizing customer experience and service delivery. The order promises 36 customer experience commitments across 17 federal agencies and includes an emphasis on reducing administrative burdens for citizens. The executive order comes after the President's Management Agenda document focuses particularly on goals for government customer service. James Isaacs is the president of Cyara, a customer service assurance platform. After a short break, he'll join me to discuss how government can improve citizen service and reduce administrative burdens.
The evolving cyber threat landscape requires constant oversight. At the same time, agencies must ensure their cybersecurity doesn't get between people and success. That's where Microsoft's comprehensive Zero Trust security model comes in to provide cybersecurity without roadblocks. Microsoft spends over $1 billion annually on security and vulnerability assessments and has committed to expanded cybersecurity support for the federal government in partnership with the Cybersecurity Executive Order. To learn more, visit Microsoft.com/federal.
The American Customer Satisfaction Index 2021 federal government report showed that citizen satisfaction in government services is in a free fall over the last few years, with declines all across indicators of satisfaction. Now, the Biden administration is trying to reverse this trend with an executive order that's emphasizing customer experience and service delivery. James Isaacs is president of Cyara, a customer service assurance platform. He joins me now to discuss how government can improve its customer service delivery. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ross. Glad to be here.
Okay, so why is customer service such a problem in government services?
Well, it's a great question. I think you can't discount just what's happened with COVID over the last 2 years, where suddenly the physical facilities were shut down. So folks who may have gone to their Social Security office or some other government agency to get service, suddenly we're thrown back to using a phone or using the website. So I think there's the sheer amount of traffic that it was suddenly thrown at, let's say, the phone systems, customer support reps, IRS agents, et cetera, was just manifold. By the way, same thing happened in the private sector. So I think over the last 2 years, it's become heavily overloaded. I think the other, and so let's grant some a little bit of leniency or understanding in that. I think in general, however, private sector versus the public sector, the private sector ultimately, if you're not happy with the customer service you're getting, you can take your business elsewhere. Of course, for our government, we don't have a choice. If we want to get our driver's license renewed, pay our taxes, et cetera, there's only one place to go. So to some extent, I think structurally, historically, not having an alternative means the government doesn't necessarily have to compete, if you will, on customer service and customer experience.
How does the public sector customer service compared to the private sector customer service experience? I mean, I know you sort of talked about the competition aspect of it, but there are problems in the private sector as well. These things are not seamless. So how do the two compare?
So I think actually in the private sector, there's almost more scale, if you will. If you think about it, in the United States, there's 330 million people. Apple actually has 1 billion customers worldwide using the iPhone. And there's close to 3 billion people using Facebook. And so I would say the scale that the private sector has to deal with, at least the largest entities, it's way larger actually than the government. So there's a lot of skill sets that have been developed. There's a lot of just building out for kind of scale operation that the government sector hasn't had to do. And I think the other thing there's again, due to competition, there's almost a relentless need to continue to invest and to improve. And so I think there's per capita, there's just a lot more money being put in investment on the private sector than the government sector.
Contractors are a huge part of the public sector customer service experience. What's the role of them in improving government public sector customer service?
So yeah, it's really interesting. On the government side, there's a lot of, and this is good, protection around security. So becoming cleared to do business with the government. A contractor has to go through all kinds of background checks, which is a good thing. To qualify to sell cloud services to the government, you have to meet your company has to meet a series of security checks called FedRAMP, and which is, fairly arduous. And that's a good thing. The government, maintain security and protect us and all that. Generally, in the private sector, there's more degrees of freedom on hiring contractors. There's not quite as arduous, shall we say, security background checks, et cetera. And so there's more degrees of freedom to use some contractors on a subcontract on a short-term basis, et cetera, than the government, where the contracting process to get yourself ready to do business, for example, with the federal government, it's pretty difficult. And it makes it difficult, I'll say, for the smallest firms to even qualify for it. And that, I think the net effect of that is that the government loses the opportunity to get access to or a window into some cutting edge and innovative things that are going on with smaller companies. I think that's the gist of it.
To that end, obviously, contractors deal a lot in technology. Technology is a big part of the executive order and, to a lesser extent, the presidential management agenda emphasis on public sector customer service. So what's the role of tech in this sort of endeavor and in customer service more broadly?
It's funny, but by the way, I was delighted to see that the Biden administration came out with executive order. At least it set out a roadmap and a pathway and set an emphasis on improving customer experience, which actually again opens the roadway to more and more, I'll say, cutting edge technologies applied. But what's funny is I don't think it's always the technology. I think a lot of it's like how you organize. So for example, in the private sector over the last 20 years, there's some habits and practices of how you organize a technology company and how you organize a development process. They go under the rubrics of agile, DevOps, scaled agile framework, which are now have become highly codified, almost canon. And how do you organize a technology enterprise? You can there are whole classes and certifications you can get in this. And for example, maybe just diving into one of them, DevOps. So that's the terminology where the development group and the operations group are kind of almost joined together. Where in olden times, say 20, 30 years ago, development would write some code and they would throw it over the wall to the operations group to operate it, mostly in, say, a mainframe, type environment. So what DevOps does is constant development, constant testing, and constant shipping of new features. So I think it's Amazon that changes their website something like 23,000 times a day. And you can only do that if you have a practice around DevOps and Agile. So technology is really, really important, but I actually think it has more to do with how do you organize yourself? How have you trained your folks? Do you have kind of a continuous innovation, kind of outlook on it?
There's sort of a hurdle there when it comes to technology, particularly when it comes to access and sort of comfort. I know this is something we've talked about on the show a fair amount. We did a recent episode with some researchers who did a study about how postcards are effective when it comes to administrative burdens. So what are those limits, and how do agencies sort of get around the limits of people's sometimes discomfort, particularly without access, with technology?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Some agencies have dictated you can only. So I live in California. You want to pay your estimated taxes, got to do it online. Which unfortunately, and there's still part of the population, a small tail that doesn't have access to computers, et cetera. So that kind of freezes some people out. So I think the government's got to maintain. And I think where you're going with your comment though about postcards is there's some things that actually turn out to be more observable and more having a higher utility for the purposes of notification, et cetera, than maybe technology. But I think we're on the edge of a AI-driven chatbot universe. We're just not there yet. And so if I were going to point to some of the the limits of technology, I would say you can't solely rely on an AI-fueled chatbot on a website to answer sophisticated, complex questions. You can divert a lot and you can provide a lot of information on it, and you can go digital first, but still at this point in time, you're going to need a human being often to answer things. So I think while the technology is getting much better, the limits of it are that it's not, it can't be a completely self-service, type world. And I think a lot of times when people think that, for example, some AI-fueled chatbot is going to replace, every customer support rep or say an IRS agent answering a question or et cetera, I think we're still a ways off of that. Kind of where the limits of it are, in a chatbot, present a question, and usually what works best is presenting 4 or 5 selected answers and see if you've correctly interpreted intention. But the limits of the technology right now is you cannot perfectly understand. I'll call it complex intentions or questions. Still need a human being as a backstop on that. It still seems to be there.
So talking about those human beings, and we'll end on this, the management agenda vision, as I referenced earlier, and the EO, talk a lot about federal workforce engagement and its connection to customer service. How do these connections get made? How do they go forward?
It's funny, the number one thing that drives employee engagement, employee satisfaction of people who are in a customer support role, customer facing role, is empowerment and to make a decision. So although this is outside of government, there's a book written, it was some time ago, called From Worst to Best. And it was about Continental Airlines that was in J.D. Power 10th place, and it got to first place in 1 year. And the gentleman who wrote the book, Bethune, was CEO of that company. But one of the things they did was, and I think almost because they had nothing left to lose, they put every single customer support rep had the ability to give out free business class seats. And what they started doing, they started to win back customers giving them, rides to the airport, pickup times, et cetera. And it's not that they offered this to everybody, but the customer support rep had the ability to make a decision, and they were told, you own that next caller's customer experience. You own it. You have some tools to take care of it. So if you want an engaged employee force who's like lit up when the phone rings and they're taking care of it, put them in a place to make decisions and to drive it. And so I think some of the difficulty you can imagine, just project yourself into a government situation. Somebody's calling up about their Social Security. Somebody's calling up about their IRS refund. You could potentially have some challenging issues there with the IRS agent or whoever's answering the phone. I'm going to okay your refund, et cetera. There's perhaps some limits to what I just described, but if you want an engaged employee force that is doing the customer support job, which is a very challenging, very difficult job, you've got to give them the power to make decisions. I think for the most part, think about it. Whenever we call, if you're going to call the cable company or call the phone company or call the government, it's usually because you've got a problem. So when you pick up that phone, you're probably, presenting a situation to that customer support rep that's like a -10, if you will. And that support person has to, raise you back up to, positive territory, so we say. So, but I think that's the key. I think that challenge is probably a lot more difficult in the government sector, just because of what we, described, and that may have fewer degrees of freedom due to the nature of what the service is. But that's the pathway. That's the how we get there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know the administration is making an emphasis of it, and hopefully we'll see it in the future. I think the pandemic has shown sometimes there's some real hurdles there, and depending on the amount of actors, it can make it even more complicated. But hopefully this emphasis will be heeded and go forward. James, thanks for being on the show with us.
Thank you, Russ. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to GovExec Daily. Our show was produced by Adam Butler and hosted by me, Ross John Fortune. We want to thank James Isaacs for joining the program. Our music is the song Signals by Catfish Dancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can email us any feedback at podcast@govexec.com or hit us up on Twitter @govexec. We'd love to hear from you. We'll talk to you later.
Hello and welcome. I'm Tara Lerman, Deputy Editor of Branded Content for GovExec Studio 2G, and I'm sitting down today with Jason Payne, Chief Technology Officer for Microsoft Federal. Today, Jason's going to share his insights on the importance of cybersecurity, what it takes to secure America's future, and how Microsoft is already working to help the public sector do so. Jason, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you start by giving us a bit of insight into the ways that cybersecurity is integral to U.S. economic growth and prosperity?
Digital transformation is the engine and the heart of really a lot of the economic growth and prosperity that we're currently enjoying. It's obvious when we see tech sector headlines in the news, but when you do a little bit of digging behind the top level headlines there, you see that the winners in a lot of the industry sectors, whether those are in retail or government, healthcare or other, is really those organizations that are driving tech intensity to get efficiencies, differentiated offerings, and as a result, either significant growth or improved citizen services. Really what we recognize there is then that disruption of the digital capabilities and environments that enable all of that have real physical and monetary impact on our nation. When the US is really increasingly facing more sophisticated and targeted cyber attacks that threaten our critical assets that result in economic growth, and certainly our personal security and privacy. And really from a technology perspective, we really think that these assets and technologies will continue to be attacked and exploited, and without increased cybersecurity capabilities, possibly even destroyed in places. And that the recent cyber executive order was a great step forward for the federal government to recognize this challenge, the ever evolving and increasingly sophisticated threats that are out there across the digital ecosystem, On those core areas that the cyber EO identifies around zero trust and secure cloud adoption, endpoint detection and response, data identification, secure software development. These are all pillars upon which we can hopefully protect U.S. economic growth and prosperity from these cyber disruptions.
And how can public-private partnerships really play a role in improving cybersecurity for the public sector?
Yeah, this is also something that we've been exploring a lot here at Microsoft. And I think the short answer is in many ways. And it's really not just that they can, but that they really already are. Microsoft is engaged with NIST and collaborating with Zero Trust and across the board with other organizations such as CISA and OMB on secure software supply chain, consumer software labeling, the AI risk management framework, and the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. But when I think about these public-private partnerships and the role that they play in cybersecurity, it really should be broader than any one initiative. And I think that collectively, we really need to focus on two aspects of the partnerships. I think the first of which would be the early stage collaborations, which really discover the art of the possible and where we need to go collectively. And then really the late stage collaboration to make sure and ensure that our cyber objectives are achieved. And so at the end of the day, all of which creates an advantage for our attackers and then frankly, impossible challenges for us in the private and public sector as defenders. And so with all of these cyber threats knocking on the door daily, it's more important now than ever that we work together to be on the same page, that we ensure both the safety of our digital assets as well as the prosperity of the nation that we touched on a bit earlier.
Can you speak about Microsoft's recent $150 million provision to government to help upgrade security?
Absolutely. We at Microsoft recognize that we have a great responsibility in securing our nation's critical assets with the prevalence of our tools and market. And specifically, our investment here has been to modernize, secure, and defend Microsoft tools, particularly deployed in federal, state, and local environments. Where this investment really is directed is at our Fast Track program. And this is really helping agencies modernize and establish zero trust architectures and principles, controls within their organizations, and modernize legacy technologies. I would like to highlight we're also committing to the White House to expand our partnerships with community colleges and nonprofits for cybersecurity training and skilling in the workforce. I think it's widely recognized that not only do we have a technology gap that the private industry is helping close in the immediate short term, but that long term, for us to continue to defend our cyber landscape, we need more knowledgeable and capable workforce. And this investment is really helping close that gap as well.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Jason, thank you so much for joining me. And thanks to everyone for listening to our podcast.